The galactic court hung like a cathedral of iron over a blue world, and Alex Mercer knelt beneath its lights. Magistrate Voren said, "Humanity stands condemned." The words rang like hammers on hull plate, and the chamber stilled. Alex felt chains bite, tasted metal, and counted breaths he could still own. Elias Ward watched from a gilded gallery, and his smile was a wound that did not bleed. Commander Mara Cade said, "Accept the sentence and spare the rest," and her metals clicked like teeth. The screens bloomed with wars and ash, and the crowd drank the image until doubt starved. Counselor Saris lowered her gaze, and sorrow moved across her like a passing moon. Alex said, "You are not judging me, you are judging the fire that learned to speak." The lights dimmed, and in the hush a thread of voice slid from shadow. The shade said, "They are not only judging you, they are judging us all." Silence fell like ash after the sigil dimmed, and the narrator traced the scar that memory left on Alex Mercer. A child on a burning coast taught him that smoke tastes like coins and endings. Mara Cade said, "Compliance buys breath," and the words dragged like nets through his past. Elias Ward said, "History favors the adaptable," and the court lights coldly agreed. Alex remembered a hand he failed to hold, and the sea that took the name it carried. Counselor Saris watched the tremor in his jaw and understood the private cost of masks. Magistrate Voren said, "Your species rehearsed ruin," and the gallery murmured assent. The shade's whisper threaded the air again, promising that truth nests where power averts its gaze. Alex said, "I will answer for the living and the dead," and he steadied his breath. The chamber waited, hungry for the next fracture to show the marrow beneath. The tribunal resumed with a pageant of certainty, and the narrator mapped its choreography across stone and light. Magistrate Voren said, "Exhibits commence," and 1,000 screens woke like hostile stars. Mara Cade said, "Accept the mercy of order," and her voice carried the ache of spent courage. Elias Ward said, "Humanity confuses appetite with destiny," and the gallery leaned closer. Alex tasted dust and old thunder as the reel of atrocities turned with ritual confidence. Counselor Saris said, "Context matters," and her words slipped through the noise like a thin blade. The shade's presence pooled behind pillars, and the air felt warped where no heat burned. The court expected surrender, not sentences that stood up and argued. Alex said, "Play them all, then play what you cut," and the chamber paused. Doubt, once a rumor, began to breathe like a newborn animal in the dark. The evidence marched in perfect boots, and the narrator measured its rhythm against the gaps between frames. A village burned without wind, and the smoke moved wrong, looping like a tethered ghost. Alex said, "That banner never flew there," and the nearest screen hesitated. Elias Ward said, misremembering, "is a human gift," and he did not look at the footage. Mara Cade said, "Stand down," yet her pupils tightened with unspent guilt. Counselor Saris said, "Metadata," and numbers opened like seeds under her touch. Magistrate Voren said, "Irrelevant," and the gavel of light returned to its cold orbit. The shade's whisper coiled. "They fear the detail that survives the fire." Alex felt the chamber twitch as a splice line flashed like a blade. Truth did not shout. It turned its face slightly and let the light find the scar. Night bled toward a colder morning, and the narrator saw resolve crystallize where breath met iron. Magistrate Voren said, "Sentence stands pending ordeal," and the floor seemed to tilt. Elias Ward said, "Survival requires performance," and his smile asked for applause. Mara Cade said, "Do not fight what cannot be moved," yet a nerve jumped in her jaw. Counselor Saris said, "Endurance is evidence," and the words hung like lanterns over black water. The shade said, "Live through tomorrow, and doors will open," and the fog around the pillars thickened. Alex said, "Then let tomorrow come," and he lifted his wrists toward the lights. The gallery shifted, tasting the possibility of fracture inside the ritual. Somewhere behind the walls, a child's laugh echoed from a memory that refused the leash. The chamber sealed, and the verdict waited like frost on a blade. Morning crept through the detention viewport like a thin confession, and the narrator followed it across Alex Mercer's scars. He remembered a beach where sirens outshouted gulls, and smoke wrote names no tide could read. Mara Cade said, "Obedience preserves," and the phrase clung like damp canvas to a drowning man. Elias Ward said, "Adapt or be archived," and his smile treated grief as a useful lever. Counselor Sarah said, "Memory can testify," and her eyes gathered quiet in their pale light. Alex tasted the nickel of fear, and found it unchanged by time or sky. He had not been chosen for glory, he had been chosen because pain had taught him to keep moving. The shade said, "Survival is a grammar they do not speak," and the corridor bent its echo around the words. Alex said, "I carry the living," and his breath steadied against the cold. The court would soon demand a soul measured in evidence and endurance. He would give them neither without price. The narrator drew a line from the cell to a younger Alex, standing in a hospital corridor, painted the color of waiting. Machines spoke in shy beeps, and fate wore paper shoes. Alex said, "Hold on, Lena," and the plea rattled the hinges of his voice. A doctor said, "What wars often say," and the world stepped 3 inches to the left. Mara Cade said, "Loss is a rank you keep," and she signed a form that weighed more than a gun. Elias Ward said, "Pain focuses talent," and he offered a path greased with promises. Counselor Sarah said, "Grief sharpens the witness," and she watched the old hurt flare under present chains. The shade said, "They fear the spark that survives the flood," and the lights flickered like tired eyes. Alex carried a ring that never fit right on peace. He learned to speak softly to rage until it worked for him. He would bring that voice to the tribunal and let it bite. Training fields climbed a hill of rusted helicopters, and the narrator watched Alex learn how to wire his heartbeat to purpose. Drill thunder rolled until it sounded like weather. Mara Cade said, "Discipline closed the wound," and her gaze pinned each failure to the map. Alex said again, and the word struck sparks off gravel. Elias Ward said, "Ambition needs a patron," and his shadow stretched over the range with tidy grace. Counselor Sarah said, "Patterns expose motive," and her tablet drew circles around anomalies in his past. The shade said, "Every oath hides a hunger," and the wind pressed sand into Alex's palms like quiet knives. He learned to breathe through hurt until hurt obeyed him. He learned that mercy without spine becomes apology. When the tribunal tore open his history, they would find a framework built from refusal. He would stand on it even if the floor fell away. Night exercises taught silence to carry weight, and the narrator measured how darkness edits fear. Alex crawled beneath wire that sang a thin metal hymn. Mara Cade said, "Quiet is a tactic," and the moon accepted the promotion. Elias Ward said, "Noise sells better," and he filed a note on human spectacle. Counselor Sarah said, "Absence is evidence too," and her fingertip paused over a blank in the record. The shade said, "They cannot audit what refuses to be seen," and the stars blinked like tired clerks. Alex remembered a child's laugh trapped in rubble, and the way dust turns to paste with tears. He decided to become a hinge that pain could turn without breaking. He would speak briefly, and he would aim for bone. The court prized pageantry over truth, but it still bled when cut right. He would make his words a small, accurate blade. Dawn returned the cell to its modest kingdom, and the narrator gathered the threads that had refused to fray. Alex turned the ring once and set it beside his breath. Counselor Sarah said, when they asked for confession, offer context, and the advice felt like shelter. Elias Ward said, "Context is camouflage," and he smiled as if selling umbrellas in a drought. Mara Cade said, "Stand straight when they bend you," and the floor steadied beneath the order. The shade said, "Endure the next day," and the lock will forget its job, and the ceiling seemed to listen. Alex said, "I will not let grief be rented by my enemies," and the air lost a little of its chill. He had been ashore for storms that did not ask permission. He could be that again for a watching galaxy. The guards approached with schedules and certainty, and neither mattered much now. He rose like a verdict that had learned to walk. The tribunal summoned history like a storm taught to obey, and screens bloomed. Magistrate Voren said, "Proceed," and the hall folded into ritual silence. Alex Mercer stood as wars paraded in sterile light. Mara Cade said, "Face what you forged," though her gaze skimmed the floor. Elias Ward said, "Context is convenient," and his smile priced sorrow by the ounce. Counselor Sarah said, "Sequence the record," and her fingers drew order from noise. The shade breathed near the pillars where sight thins. A city fell again, and the gallery drank its ruins. Alex said, "Show the edges where truth catches," and a ripple touched the front row. The narrator marked the room, learning the shape of its doubt. Fear dressed as certainty, and certainty blinked. The evidence marched with metronome calm, but the narrator heard a skipped beat. A banner flickered wrong, and shadows leaned against their sources. Alex said, "Freeze frame 93, and the wall obeyed like a held breath. Counselor Saris said, "Lighting vectors misalign, and numbers opened like seeds." Mara Cade said, "Irrelevant," yet a muscle in her jaw misfired. Magistrate Voren said, "Continue," and the gavel of light orbited again. Elias Ward said, "Artifacts haunt human recollection," and his ring tapped once. The shade whispered, "Follow the seam until it bleeds," and the air cooled. A splice line shone like a hair across glass. The gallery shifted, as if a chair leg cracked. They cued a massacre filmed from two skies at once, and the narrator counted the suns. Alex said, "Your camera stands where no roof existed," and murmurs rose. Mara Cade said, "Hold your claims," but her eyes chased the angle. Counselor Sarah said, "Parallax fails the map," and a screen bowed to math. Elias Ward said, "Theatrics erode pity," and his smile asked the crowd to agree. Magistrate Voren said, "Guilt survives these quibbles," and the sigil brightened. The shade hummed, "Truth is patient," and the walls gathered cold. Alex felt the room tilt toward the possibility of fraud. He did not smile. He counted breaths, and let the silence weigh what the images could not. Doubt learned a name. Recess cracked the day, and the narrator followed Alex into a corridor that held echoes. Steel smelled like rain that never fell. The shade said, "They will call you liar, so borrow their math." Alex said, "Then I will use their tools to open their locks." Mara Cade passed without a word, and the silence wore rank. Elias Ward said, "Withdraw your accusations and leave with dignity," and the phrasing was a leash. Counselor Cyrus said, "Return with a list," and a thin card slid into Alex's cuff. Magistrate Voren's voice carried through vents like a cold recital. Alex closed his eyes and let memory line up beside proof. The narrator watched fear become a ledger. The door sighed, and duty returned. The session resumed, and the narrator felt the chamber brace. Alex said, "Enter exhibit list Gamma through Kappa," and the wall answered with reluctant light. Counselor Cyrus said, "Cross correlate sources," and the timelines braided. Mara Cade said, "Stand down," but the order lacked heat. Elias Ward said, "You gamble with pity you cannot afford," and his ring stilled. Magistrate Voren said, "This court decides relevance," and the sigil burned whiter. The shade breathed, "Aim for the joint, not the bone," and Alex pointed to a date that should not exist. The gallery leaned as if to hear numbers better. A scaffold of lies creaked. The narrator marked the instant when narrative lost its leash. The narrator opened the chamber on a new day, where judgment demanded pain instead of words. Magistrate Voren said, "Begin the ordeal," and the floor split into corridors of fire and steel. Alex Mercer stood with wrists unbound yet waited. Mara Cade said, "Survival is spectacle," and her eyes betrayed the cost. Elias Ward said, "Failure proves inevitability," and his smile sharpened. Counselor Sarah said, "Endurance is evidence," and she tightened her veil. The shade whispered, "Pain is their theater, but truth waits backstage." Alex said, "Then I will outlast their script," and he stepped forward. The chamber's silence became hunger. The ordeal was not trial but trap. The narrator marked the shift. Humanity was not judged for sin but for persistence. The ordeal began with walls that closed like jaws, and the narrator counted Alex's breaths. Alex pressed against steel that hissed with heat. Mara Cade said, "End it quickly," yet her jaw clenched. "Elias Ward," said the spectacle feeds trust, and the gallery nodded. Counselor Saris whispered, "Look for the seam," and her fingers traced invisible patterns. Magistrate Voren said, "Human fragility will write the verdict," and the gavel of light pulsed. The shade said, "Fragility bends but does not vanish," and air cooled against Alex's cheek. Alex said, "If you want me broken, you must wait," and his body bore the fire. The narrator marked how suffering became evidence, and evidence became weapon. The second stage spilled water into fire, and the narrator felt the hiss rise like steam-born ghosts. Alex staggered as chains dragged weight across his shoulders. Magistrate Voren said, "Burden defines the species," and his voice cracked coldly. Mara Cade said, "Every soldier learns collapse," yet her eyes watered. Elias Ward said, "The theater applauds suffering," and his smirk deepened. Counselor Sarah said, "Observe the imbalance," and her slate glowed faintly. The shade whispered, "Carry more than weight," and Alex inhaled the command. Alex said, "I carry a world," and step by step he rose. The gallery hushed. The narrator marked that resilience had become rebellion. The third ordeal was illusion, and the narrator traced lies painted as memory. Screens replayed Alex's failures with twisted faces. A familiar smile emerged. Elias Ward said, "Truth is pliable," and he stood inside the projection. Alex's breath caught. Betrayal stung sharper than flame. Mara Cade said, "This is theater, not justice," yet her voice wavered. Counselor Sarah said, "Corruption hides in staging," and her hand trembled. Magistrate Voren said, "Identity is proof of guilt," and his tone hardened. The shade whispered, "Betrayal sharpens the edge you need." Alex said, "You were never my ally," and the illusion cracked with his fury. The narrator marked the moment deception, unmasked its author. The ordeal neared its end, and the narrator felt the chamber tremble. Chains hung slack, but spirits strained. Magistrate Voren said, "Verdict approaches," and his eyes glittered. Mara Cade said, "This will not erase him," and her tone broke rank. Elias Ward said, "Then let despair finish what fire could not," and his words struck like knives. Counselor Saris said, "He has endured," and her voice carried more than sorrow. The shade whispered, "Now speak and the galaxy will hear." Alex said, "I am not the crime you fear. I am the proof you cannot silence," and silence rippled. The narrator marked resilience transforming into accusation. Humanity was feared, not judged. The narrator opened on silence heavy as iron, where the tribunal expected collapse but found defiance. Alex Mercer stood bloodied, his tunic torn, yet his eyes burned brighter than the lights above. Magistrate Voren said, "Speak your last words," and his voice carried steel. Mara Cade said, "They will not hear you," but her hands trembled against the rail. Elias Ward said, "A final performance before erasure," and his smile cut like glass. Counselor Saris whispered, "The galaxy watches," and her gaze urged him forward. The shade said, "Make your scars their mirror," and the chamber chilled. Alex said, "I will not plead, I will remind." The gallery leaned, pulled by a gravity older than law. The narrator mocked words becoming weapons sharper than chains. The hall brightened with 1,000 screens replaying ruin, and the narrator framed Alex's voice against them. Alex said, "You call us destroyers, yet you forget who rebuilds." His tone cracked like stone under pressure. Magistrate Voren said, "Rebuilding does not erase destruction." Mara Cade said, "Sacrifice is not remembered here," though her eyes glistened. Elias Ward said, "A gallery loves villains," and his ring tapped. Counselor Saris said, "Memory refuses erasure," and her voice carried weight. The shade whispered, "Show them grief they cannot translate." Alex spoke of mothers burying sons and fathers shielding daughters. The chamber stiffened as images shifted to faces of the living. The narrator marked the gallery leaning forward, listening for the first time. The chamber roared with unease, and the narrator felt cracks spreading through its marble certainty. Alex said, "We rise after ruin. That is what you fear." The words lanced the gallery. Magistrate Voren said, "Fear is irrelevant," yet his jaw tightened. Mara Cade whispered, "Resilience is rebellion," as if to herself. Elias Ward said, "Hope is dangerous currency," his smile faltering. Counselor Saris said, "Truth has found air," and she stood taller. The shade murmured, "Now you wound the silence." Alex lifted his voice, "You cannot erase endurance." The gallery stirred with voices clashing, factions fracturing. The narrator marked that this was no longer judgment, it was awakening. Then came the shattering sacrifice, and the narrator traced it like lightning across night. A guard lunged at Alex, but Counselor Saris stepped down. Saris said, "Enough," and her body shielded his. Energy cut her frame, and sorrow tore the hall. Magistrate Voren said, "Betrayal," but his tone cracked with disbelief. Mara Cade shouted, "No," and the word echoed like gunfire. Elias Ward said, "This is chaos," yet his face lost control. The shade whispered, "A seed is planted." Alex knelt, blood and grief on his hands. He said, "You fear us because we endure, because even in loss we rise." The gallery erupted. The narrator marked the sacrifice as spark igniting fire. The chamber drowned in uproar, and the narrator recorded the storm. Factions screamed, some for death, others for justice. Magistrate Voren said, "Order," but the gavel drowned beneath riot. Mara Cade said, "This trial has cracked," and her medals trembled. Elias Ward hissed, "You've doomed us all," though his voice shook. Counselor Saris lay silent, yet her sacrifice spoke louder than decrees. The shade whispered, "Now the galaxy sees." Alex rose, battered, chains dragging, and said, "We are not asking for mercy. We are demanding recognition." The words detonated across billions of screens. The narrator marked the moment when judgment became revolution, and one voice shifted the axis of history. The narrator returned to a chamber cracking under its own decree as riot clawed the air and banners shed their threads. Magistrate Voren said, "This court restores order," and the gavel of light stuttered like a failing star. Alex Mercer stood over blood and smoke, and would not step back from the breath he had claimed. Mara Cade said, "The sentence is a fuse you cannot control," and her voice carried sand from old campaigns. Elias Ward said, "Finish it before sympathy curdles," and his ring glinted like a small, cold moon. The shade said, "They fear the spark you kept alive," and the vents exhaled frost across the floor. Alex said, "You judged our ruins, not our repairs," and the crowd tilted toward possibility. Guards wavered as factions rose with homemade banners and old grief. The narrator marked the shift as certainty fractured along lines of memory and fear. Judgment tried to harden and found no surface left. The verdict ignited anyway, and the narrator felt the word extermination strike like winter against teeth. Magistrate Voren said, "By authority of the Accord, humanity ends," and the sigil flared, whiter than grief. Mara Cade said, "Call it what it is," and her hand hovered near a holster she would not draw. Elias Ward said, "History demands clean lines," though sweat gathered at his temple. The shade said, "No line survives a beating heart," and the vents sighed. Alex Mercer said, "You do not erase us. You multiply us," and his voice carried to balconies packed with doubt. A chant rose from the tiers, untidy and brave. Guards faltered as defectors loosened grips and looked away from orders. The narrator saw authority stand on ice as heat climbed from the crowd. Power found itself surrounded by its own echoes and could not name them all. The narrator followed the crack to its architect as data bled through the walls like ink in water. The shade said, "Open their hidden spine," and consoles trembled with unauthorized light. Files spilled across the chamber, mapping edits, payments, and quiet tyrannies. Alex Mercer said, "Play the parts you hid," and timelines rethreaded to show hands in the dark. Mara Cade said, "Someone paid for this verdict," and shame roughened her throat. Elias Ward said, "Security breach," though the word avoided his eyes. Magistrate Voren said, "Irrelevant." But relevance was already awake and angry. Delegates turned on one another while feeds from allied worlds demanded explanation. The narrator named it aloud, conspiracy unsewn by visibility. Truth did not roar. It vibrated like a bridge carrying too much weight, and it would not stop. Rage detonated in pockets, and the narrator timed each surge like waves against steel. Mara Cade said, "Stand down," and some listened because the old tone survived inside her chest. Elias Ward said, "Contain the narrative," and reached for signals that no longer obeyed. The shade said, "Let them hear themselves," and the feeds echoed chants from worlds tired of tidy lies. Magistrate Voren said, "This court will not bend," yet the dais creaked. Alex Mercer said, "You built a verdict out of fear, then called it law," and the sentence landed with clean weight. A guard lowered his weapon and helped a stranger rise. Delegates rewrote their positions in real time to shield from the coming audit. The narrator watched authority trade iron for smoke and lose the deal. Order did not return. It transformed into a negotiation with truth. The narrator closed on a chamber that finally heard itself as the verdict unraveled in public view. Magistrate Voren said, "Proceed with sentence," but the command arrived empty and late. Mara Cade said, "Suspend the decree pending inquiry," and the words found purchase. Elias Ward said, "Chaos will devour you," though his certainty limped. The shade said, "You have made a door where there was a wall," and the room exhaled. Alex Mercer said, "Humanity will answer for its wounds when you answer for your knives," and he stood without flinching. Delegates recorded commitments they could not easily escape. The gallery quieted, as if a storm had chosen another coastline. The narrator marked resolution not as triumph, but as a hinge turning. Tomorrow waited with teeth, but tonight the blade had been turned aside. The narrator opened the final act as silence swept the fractured tribunal, where smoke curled like unanswered prayers. Alex Mercer stood alone in the center, scarred yet alive, as voices that once condemned now whispered. Magistrate Voren said, "The decree remains," though his tone lacked the iron of before. Mara Cade said, "We have bought time, not freedom," and her medals no longer gleamed but hung, heavy as guilt. Elias Ward said, "Survival is only reprieve," his words sharp, though his confidence cracked. The shade said, "Warning is stronger than victory," and shadows thinned at the chamber's edges. Alex said, "We are unfinished," and his breath fogged the cold air. Delegates shifted, weighed between fear and reluctant respect. The narrator marked the chamber as less a courtroom now and more a theater of prophecy. The narrator carried memory into the gallery, where factions argued quieter now, as if mourning their own certainties. Mara Cade said, "He endures where armies broke," and her words fell heavier than steel. Elias Ward said, "Endurance will not shield them forever," though his eyes betrayed fear of a flame he could not smother. Magistrate Voren said, "This chamber will monitor humanity closely," yet cracks spread through his poise. The shade said, "Surveillance is not safety," and their voice coiled like smoke into corners. Alex Mercer said, "You can watch us, but you cannot unlearn what you've seen today." The crowd shifted uneasily, as though recognition tasted sharper than condemnation. The narrator marked this moment as the uneasy pact of survival, not triumph, but a scar pressed into history. The narrator followed Alex into a corridor emptied of chains but not of weight, where silence was heavier than iron. Mara Cade walked behind him, her boots striking rhythms of doubt. She said, "You are alive, but watched." Elias Ward lingered near the exit, voice low as a blade. "Survival is not victory." The shade whispered from nowhere. It is a beginning, and the words carried forward. Alex said, they tried to erase us, yet here I stand. His body bore bruises, his soul heavier scars, but his spine did not bend. Counselor Ceres's absence weighed thicker than the steel walls, her sacrifice etched into every footstep. The narrator marked the corridor as a grave, and a promise, lit only by the fragile glow of endurance. The narrator carried the weight of Ceres's fall as Alex paused at the exit bay, where stars waited with indifference. Mara Cade said, her sacrifice bought you this breath, and her voice cracked under steel. Elias Ward said, history buries martyrs swiftly, yet he turned his face away. The shade said, martyrs do not vanish. They become warnings, and shadows deepened across the hull. Alex said, her voice lives in mine, and he touched the scar at his jaw as if it remembered fire. The bay hummed with engines ready to return him to Earth, a world scarred yet unbroken. The narrator marked humanity as scarred too, but not erased, their existence now carved into galactic memory. The narrator closed on Alex walking away from the tribunal, alive yet carrying ghosts heavier than chains. He did not raise his fists in triumph. Instead, his shoulders bent under a weight the galaxy could not see. Magistrate Voron's words still rang, hollow and cracking. Mara Kay watched with conflicted pride and fear. Elias Ward whispered, this is not over, and the sound chased him like a shadow. The shade said, you have begun the warning, and their presence dissolved into silence. Alex said, they wanted a verdict, but what they got was a warning, his voice carried into the void. The narrator marked the stars listening, recording, and waiting. Humanity was spared, but not free. The galaxy now carried a scar that glowed like prophecy.